do hexagons and
All right, good evening, Earth, or
gave my impression of what on a molecule
close enough,
causes to do.
late afternoon. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting sundial. Last couple of days, I increased the number of little light point leaves. Just gave it a more dense flow across the top of the page. Composition there. And let's see what else has been done lately. I gave the frog eyes, pupils, and the crocodile. For the moment, I'm going to start in with the cobble coloration. So I've got an array of colors mixed up, and I'm just going to start kind of giving it a rhythm, not really a distinctive shape-oriented patterning.
Drug use, drug encouragement, drug proselytizing, and as a result, the word's not often encountered. In its origin, as was pointed out, it comes from psychoto, meaning in essence psychosis, and mimesis, meaning the imitation of. And this indeed is a term that very early in the work in this area that had been given these materials because they had been cast in the role of causing causing symptoms that would reflect the character of mental illness. And it was felt by studying the effects of these materials in normal subjects, you might be able to glean some insight as to the mechanisms or at least the descriptions and definitions of the syndrome seen in people who are spontaneously ill. This explanation, the search for new psychotomimetics, for materials that would be more exact in the definition of psychosis, is completely logical in that all the not all, but most of the hallucinogenics, the psychedelics that are known, can be classified into materials that are indoles, and there are many in this area, the tryptamines, the more convoluted carbolines, LSD as an ergot type indole, or it can be classified as phenethylamines. And there are perhaps some 3 or 4 score that are in this classification. The analogs of mescaline compound has been mentioned several times, or the substitution variants of mescaline, or the alpha-methyl compounds that have given rise to materials that are lumped chemically together as the amphetamines. And there are 2 principal neurotransmitters in the brain. One is an indole, and this is serotonin. One is a phenethylamine, namely dopamine. And it's very desirable from the point of the neurochemist to find pigeonholes that can classify things. Here we have a group of psychedelics that are all indoles, and we have a neurotransmitter that's indolic, serotonin. Here's a group that are all phenethylamines, and we have a neurotransmitter that's phenethylamine. All we have to do is understand why all of these work here and all of those work there, and we shall now know how the neurotransmitters work in the brain. And once we know that, we'll be able to cure mental illness. Well, it's an appealing and it has not been a particularly rewarding classification. And the explanation, besides being logical, is quite safe, because it's an unthreatening explanation. It's easily accepted by the academic and administrative community. But the explanation is still not the explanation of why I do what I do. My work is indeed dedicated to the development of tools, but tools for quite a different purpose. And here's where I want to get quite away from chemistry and into some of my own personal thoughts. I'd like to lay a little background to establish a framework for these tools, and in part to define them, and in part to give emphasis to an urgency that I really feel associated with them. First, I'm a very firm believer in the reality of a balance in all aspects of the human theater. When there seems to be a development to move that way, somehow, very shortly, or almost in concert, there is a move this way that keeps things in some delicate balance. If there must be a dichotomization of concepts into good and evil, then all good seems to contain its unexpressed evil, and all evil is unexpressed good. Within the human mind, there coexists the eros, the life-loving, the self-perpetrating force, with the thanatos, the self-destructive death wish. Both are present in each of us, but are usually separated by a very difficult wall, a very difficult to penetrate wall of the unconscious. One definition of the tools I seek is that they may allow words of a vocabulary which might allow each human being to more consciously and more clearly communicate with the interior of his own mind and psyche. This may be called a vocabulary of awareness. A person who becomes increasingly aware of, and so begins to acknowledge, the existence of the two opposite contributors to his motives and decisions may begin to make choices which are knowledgeable. And the learning process that follows such choices, the path that leads to wisdom. But just as there is a balance within the mind that needs establishment, there is an interesting record of balances of the same sort in society. Just look for a few minutes at some of the coincidences that have kept our human race in a rather precarious balance. Throughout the early centuries of the current millennium, there were carried out some of the most viciously inhuman wars ever known to man, all in the name of the forces of religion and the horrors of the Inquisition with its lethal intolerance of heresy. And yet it was during these dark years that the structure of alchemy was established. Not to change base metals into noble ones, as is often thought, but to acquire knowledge through the study of matter. The work of the alchemists extended up to the Age of Enlightenment, with the urges of rationalism and of skepticism. And it was always directed toward the learning process. The reward of alchemistic effort has been simply stated as the effort to achieve the transmutation of base metals into gold. As Ralph pointed out just a bit ago, this is not the actual reward. The value was the doing and the redoing of the process of distillation, of sublimation, of condensation, of precipitation. It was a continual, ever more exact effort to understand these processes, that from the learning of the process, one would be able to find a unity between the physical and the spiritual world. It was the doing and the redoing itself that was the reward. In the last 100 years or so, this learning process has evolved into what we call science. However, there's been a subtle shift in the goal, from the process itself to the results of the process. In this age of science, it is only the end result, the gold, that really matters. It is not the act of achieving, but the achievement itself that brings one the acknowledgement of his peers, that brings recognition from the outside world, that results in wealth and in influence and in power. And these end achievements, these results, show the same dichotomy of directions which was so evident in previous centuries. For years, there had been no separation of values. Neither direction had taken the colors of good or for evil. But still, there were incredible coincidences of timing. For example, in 1895, Wilhelm Conrad von Lincoln observed that when electricity was applied to an evacuated tube containing certain gases, a nearby plate covered with barium platinocyanide emitted a visible glow. And the next year, in 1896, Antoine-Henri Becquerel found that these same metal-producing emanations were being emitted from uranium. Radioactivity had been discovered. But it was just in the following year, at 11:45 a.m. on the 23rd of November of 1897, that Arthur Hefter consumed an alkaloid that he had isolated from the peony dumped in cactus, brought to the Western world by the irrepressible pharmacologist Louis Levine. As Hefter wrote in his notes, and this is a quotation following 150 milligrams of mescaline, "From time to time, dots with the most brilliant colors floated across the field of vision. Later on, landscapes, halls, architectural scenes also appeared." Mescaline helps with this. During the 1920s and 1930s, both worlds, that of the physical sciences involving radiation and that of the psychopharmacological sciences involving psychotropic materials, continued to develop without any clear sense of polarity, without the mine is good and yours is evil duality that was soon to come. Radioactivity and radiation were becoming the mainstays of medicine. X-ray photography was invaluable in diagnosis, and radiotherapy was broadly used in treatment. Controlled and localized radiation could destroy malignant tissue while sparing the host. And in the area of psychology, there were parallel developments. The theories of Freud and Jung were being developed into increasingly useful clinical tools and approaches to mental illness. And the basis of experimental psychology was laid in the pioneering studies of Pavlov. Another coincidence in timing, which in retrospect started a dividing of science on separate paths, occurred during World War II. In the late 1942, Enrico Fermi and several other scientists at the University of Chicago demonstrated for the first time ever, that nuclear fission could be achieved and could be controlled by man. The age of unlimited power and freedom from dependency upon our dwindling fossil reserves had begun. Just the next year, at 4:20 p.m. on the 19th of April, Albert Hoffman consumed a measured amount of a compound which he had first synthesized some 5 years earlier. As Hoffman subsequently reported, as a quotation following 250 micrograms, after the crisis of confusion and despair, I began to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and closing themselves in circles and spirals. LSD had also been discovered. But then, still, and up until the last decade, it was the rich promise of the nuclear age, first with the power and potential of fission, and later with the virtually limitless potential of fusion energy, that carried the banner and the hopes of man. And the area of the hallucinogenics was categorized as negative, psychosis imitating, psychotomimetic. It was not until sometime in the 1970s, that a strange and a fascinating and a rather frightening reversal of roles took place. The knowledge of nuclear fission and fusion took on a death-loving aspect, with country after country joining the fraternity of those skilled in the capacity for the eradication of the human experiment. And to have such power leads to the threat to use such power, which in time will actually lead to its use. But, as I said earlier, when one thing develops, there seems to spring forth a balancing, a compensatory counterpart. This balance can be realized with the psychedelic drugs. What had been simply tools for the study of psychosis at best, or for escapist self-gratification at worst, suddenly assumed the character of tools of enlightenment and of some form of transcendental communication. If man's alter ego, his thanatos, had been entrusted with the imperpetual knowledge of how he can completely destroy himself and this extraordinary experiment, then some development must occur at the eros side of his psyche that will and must afford the learning of how to live with this professional knowledge. It is a communication between these two sides of the mind that requires an extraordinary vocabulary. Where do these words come from? The words of this vocabulary. All depend upon an intimate insight into the working of the human mind, but this can be approached in many ways. The study of religion, of meditation, of self-yielding, provides a peace, but in my mind also tends toward a retreat and hence a capitulation. The efforts of amalgamate the two sides of the mind as seen in the Tao of physics and the rich findings of parallelisms between the Eastern and Western philosophies may eventually explain all and allow some unification for the human purpose. But I feel, along with many others, that the efforts being invested in the technology of destruction does not allow sufficient time. It is possibly only with the psychedelic drugs that words of vocabulary can be established which might tunnel through the subconscious between the conflicting aspects of the mind and psyche. It is here that I feel my skill lies, and this is exactly why I do what I do. Where do we stand as of today? In the last handful of years, the forces of government and nationalism have amassed an unprecedented arsenal of destructive power. The power is in the current arsenals of the world, if restructured into Hiroshima-strength weapons, to detonate one bomb every minute, on the minute, for the next 2 years. And the rationalized need to do so is becoming manifest in a frightening pace. But in the last handful of years, the number of tools of communication have increased at a like rate. There are currently nearly 200 psychedelic drugs known and described, some touching at one, some at another of the fibers that unify our minds. By learning each of their structures of sensory communication in turn, we might find a form of communication that would disarm our destructive compulsion. And indeed, what form of tools are now available to us? Some of the tools that are available, or rather that have been available, are the widely publicized drugs of psychopharmacology, such as mescaline, psilocybin, DOM, LSD. These drugs played a role in defining the transition between drugs as entertainment, escape, turn on, and drugs as instructive vehicles for learning, enlightenment, and insight. but at quite a price. They had a high profile at the time that the scheduled drug laws were written, and thus were made illegal and are not available. However, in their place there are now many, many other materials, some more limited in their instructive capacity, and some perhaps even richer. And for everyone today to weekend tomorrow. Let me describe a small sampling of the recently born materials a bit more in detail. These are examples with some quotations in some instances of experiments in which there have been actually definitions of some aspect of sensory teasing apart of the complex sensorium attack and effects that these materials can have. DIPT is an abbreviation of N,N-diisopropyltryptamine, a drug unique among the psychedelics in that it expresses a distortion in, or to an extent, a synthesis with the process of auditory integrity. It is perhaps one of the less available senses to be teased apart for special study. Many of the close relatives, as you well know, deal with the visual process and in some way will change or synthesize or modify the visual integrity, but a rather interesting distinction between the drug-induced psychosis and endogenous schizophrenia is that very often in the latter, the primary sensory character that is affected is the auditory influence. A quotation following 20 milligrams of DIPT. The telephone sounds partly underwater. Here are signs of a pitch change on radio. The absolute pitch down a major third. Chord on the piano sounds out of tune, quite flat. Music terrible, unlistenable. The other senses seem to no way affected. If I were deaf, I would have thought this an inactive drug. Several hours after ingestion of the material, this note. Hearing normal, piano back in tune. MDMA, or MDMA, is abbreviation for 3,4-methylenedioxy-methamphetamine. It's a tool of communication that has shown, in recent years, an extraordinary utility in opening communication between individuals. This has promoted its use in psychotherapy, but has given promise as well as a vehicle for intrapersonal communication. This particular drug has been used clinically in many applications, and these today in probably number in the thousands. And it has commanded a remarkably good record of positive results. A quotation following 120 milligrams. We kept up a lively conversation covering many interesting aspects of our various family relationships. The conversation was unusually insightful and free of defensiveness. And following a 40 milligram supplement at the 2-hour point, Jean glowed with energy, became very beautiful. We talked freely and openly. Every bush and plant looks utterly alive. I am entranced by a large rock. As I look at its surface, I see the surface of a planet with mountains and valleys. Little crystals of mica are like jewels. Another material, 2CB, is the abbreviation for 2,5-dimethoxy-4-bromophenethylamine. A tool and a word of vocabulary which ties the mental process directly and constructively into the physical soma. The analgesic effects experienced with many, if not most, of the psychedelic drugs are not present with 2CB. On the contrary, there is an increased body awareness of every kind, including skin sensitivity, heightened responsiveness to smells, tastes, to sexual stimulation. One experiences increased consciousness of physical health and energy, or, on the other hand, sharpened awareness of any body imbalance or discomfort. 2CB allows rich visual imagery and intense eyes-closed fantasy without cluttering up of the mental field with too many elaborations. A quotation following 20 milligrams. Along with the awareness of the body and the ability to deeply enjoy the fact that one is a physical as well as a spiritual being, the experience of 2CB allows exploration as far as one needs to go. There is at all times full connection with all parts of oneself, the emotional and the intellectual.